Good evening, all. I welcome you to the second session of the Sammisti Samvid series. And today we will deal upon very relevant topics for the startups, which include fundraising cycle and various instruments that can be issued by a startup for raising funds, importance of legal contracts, and ESOP. So my partner Prashant at Samisti Legal, he will be deliberating on the first two topics, and I'll deliberate on the last two. So over to you, Prashant.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. Welcome all. Today the topic for discussion, as Anita rightly pointed out, would be the nitty-gritties of fundraising, and then we will touch upon what are the instruments which are available for a company to get funding into the company, and then valuation matrix under different laws. It could be income tax, Companies Act, exchange control regulations. So this will be the basic agenda of the discussion which I will be taking up today. My colleague Anita, as she said, she will be talking about ESOP and legal contracts. So we will start with the topic of what is the process of raising funds and how a company should basically start and work towards from day one, from scratch, to basically attract funding into the company. What are the collaterals which are required for a company to be funding ready? So that would be the crux of the topic, which is funding. And then we will touch upon the instrument which are available under Companies Act, and then the valuations. So when I basically say the collaterals and the crux for a funding for a business to basically attract funding from different investors, it could be a private equity investor or a strategic investor, and it could be a company which is a startup, or it could be a company which has basically raised seed money or a Series A, Series B. The process remains same for all companies. It could be a startup or a growth stage company, but for a startup, maybe the process could be cut short with respect to basically doing the funding exercise in a shorter manner. So when I say shorter manner, the investor who is coming in, maybe he will do only limited due diligence. He will not basically waste time on the business diligence. But when the company grows, when it is Series A, Series B, Series C, the investors are there are already multiple investors in the company, so it takes a longer time for the new investors to close the deal. So that is the process in terms of the funding. But let's discuss the entire ecosystem when a company wants to raise funding, and what are the nitty-gritties, how the company should basically structure itself and get ready for the funding. So the first thing which the company has to think through is, when is the money required? Because taking external capital at a wrong time also will be expensive for the promoters. So when the promoter thinks that it is right time to take the money, is an important call, whether the money will go for the working capital, whether the money will go for capex, whether the promoter has different avenues to bring in money, whether the promoter wants to basically not dilute his equity and borrow debt. So and what is the valuation the market is offering, whether the company has started and then it currently doesn't have that kind of need to basically attract higher valuation, but the potential of the business would be high, then the promoter would not want to dilute at a very early stage. So first thing which the promoter has to think through is, when and how would be the when and from which investor the funding should be brought in. When I say when, it has to be right time. It cannot be too early or it cannot be too late. So when I say too early, it eventually means that if your company is not having revenues, but you still want money, and you end up getting a lower valuation, then the cost of dilution of equity will be high, and the potential of business is very high in future. So it is very important to make sure that we take equity capital, external capital at a right time. It should not be too early. So that is one bit which the promoter has to think through and then work on it. Then only they should basically take the funding. And who will be the potential investor? Whether the potential investor will be a HNI, venture capitalist, or PE guys if it's a Series B, Series C funding, or it could be a strategic guy. So when I say strategic guy, maybe the companies who are in the similar business, who are the tycoons of that business, or who are basically having vertical or horizontal integration with the company, with the promoter's business. So that could be a strategic what do you call that investor would be a strategic investor, and maybe the company who is looking for fund, they can choose whether they want to go with a strategic investor from multiple standpoint, or they should go for a VC or a PE guy. So choosing a right investor and a kind of investor is also very important. And then once you have thought through that you are ready for funding and what kind of investors you want to target, then the process of funding will start. So generally what happens is the companies, the startups in India are already formed with private limited company kind of a structure, and immediately they get friends and family invested in the company. And then maybe once the model is proven, there is a proof of concept, then there is an external requirement, then the promoter goes into the market and then starts the process of funding. But in case if the business has started and you have not formed the company, you are working in a different structure like a partnership or a sole proprietorship firm, then eventually you have to structure your business. So you have to form a private limited company, because generally in India, any external money which is coming in would be only in the form of equity into a private limited company. If you are a LLP, then still you have chances, but it is always better that you are a private limited company, because that is the well accepted vehicle in India for investment. So if you are already having a private limited company, absolutely fine. If you don't have a private limited company, then think through. If you have a LLP, you still want to go ahead, then maybe you can go ahead. Or if you are in a structure which is a traditional partnership firm or a sole proprietorship firm, then you have to convert your business into a limited liability entity. It could be a LLP or a private company. Once your vehicle is ready, then you prepare your business plan and marketing collaterals. So when I say business plan is something which will give the projections of your business for next 4 or 5 years. And then marketing collaterals could be your teaser, could be the profiles of your management, or any your peer group valuations. So those kind of collaterals have to be prepared. And then once you have the business plan collateral, generally what happens is, for a startup, startup will not hire an investment banker who will run the process. But if the company is at a stage where it has already gone through Series A, Series B, then maybe for running a process and for a price discovery, you would appoint an investment banker who will run the process. And if it's a hot cake, then you will get bids from the investor. The investment banker will run the entire process and then sell the equity of the company. But if you are a company which is into which is basically a startup, and this could be a seed investment or a Series A investment, then maybe generally investment banker are not appointed. But if you are appointed the investment banker, then they will prepare the business plan, marketing collateral in discussion with the promoters. So that would be the step 2. Then once you have the business model prepared and marketing collaterals ready, and you have discussed with the potential investors, then maybe if you have discussed the deal with 4 or 5 investors, then out of which you may find 2 investors, 3 investors interesting, and they may find the company interesting, and then you shortlist and get the term sheets from the investors. So generally what happens is, if there is one investor who has given a term sheets are generally non-binding. So investor will give you a term sheet which will talk about basic deal terms, what is the pre-money valuation, what is the percentage of equity which the investor wants, and what kind of rights he wants. He will give you a flavor. He will not get into the full-fledged rights at the term sheet stage, because they want to do the diligence, then understand the business, and then they take a call whether they want to invest in the company or not. But once they have given the term sheet, that means they are convinced that this business has value and they want to invest. So that's how the term sheet comes. The promoter negotiates. It's a non-binding term sheet, and it is generally exclusive. So once we have signed a term sheet with the investor, then you cannot shop around and then talk to the other investors. Wherein basically what happens is, the promoter has a term sheet. He can go to the market and say, I have a term sheet from XYZ who has given me the valuation of 10 crores. Then the other investor can come, okay, I'll give you 15 crores valuation. So that should not happen. So they give an exclusivity restriction, wherein you will not be able to talk to an investor during that certain exclusive period. So as part of term sheet, once you have agreed the exclusivity, then they will start the process of due diligence. So when I say due diligence are basically of 3 types. One is legal due diligence, the other one is financial diligence, and for the business which are complex and which are having different revenue streams, and the investor wants to basically see whether the quality of earnings which the business has is sustainable or not, then they will get into the business diligence. So at early stage, maybe the investors will not do it, but at a Series B, Series C stage, they will also want to do a business diligence to understand the potential of the business. But for a startup, maybe legal and financial due diligence are obvious, and business diligence could depend upon the investor who is coming in. So legal due diligence is done to identify what are the risks in the business in terms of regulatory and legal framework, and to basically historically review the compliance level of the company. They do a legal diligence. They will appoint a lawyer. The lawyer will do the LDD, and then in the process they will try to find, are there any non-compliances, are there any risk in the business. So that is something they will try to find out as part of the diligence. The same goes with the financial diligence. Legal due diligence is more from a legal side. Financial diligence is more from a number crunching side. So but the revenues which the company has recognized, are they what do you call sustainable, quality of earning, what kind of customer the company has, whether the company revenues are dependent on only one customer. All that the financial DD guy will see, along with all the fiscal law compliances and everything. So FDD is done, LDD is done. Then then the stage of what do you call negotiation and valuation comes. So at the term sheet stage, you get a term sheet. There is a valuation which is already given by the investor. But generally, what happens is after the due diligence is done, if the business has a lot of what do you call issues, or if there are any findings as part of the financial diligence, the investor would definitely want to downgrade the valuation. So based on the legal diligence, financial diligence, if the investor believes that the valuation the investor has given in the term sheet will not be sustainable and they have to rework on the valuation, then they will negotiate on the valuation and then negotiate on the what do you call final number, what kind of equity they want and what will be the pre-money valuation. Otherwise, LDD is done, FDD is done, then they move on to the definitive documents. So when I say definitive documents, generally it is a subscription agreement which the investor will give and ask the company to basically review it. So generally it covers the terms of what do you call investment, what kind of percentage of equity they will get, and the representation and warranty. So we will discuss more on the terms of the dev docs in the next slides. But once the valuation is frozen, DD is done, you get the dev docs. As part of the dev docs, there will be certain conditions which you have to fulfill. Once you have fulfilled the conditions, the closing formalities are completed and the deal gets closed. So this is the entire horizon of a fundraise. Generally, if I have to give you a timeline for a seed investment, you start with a discussion with the investor. So I'm not taking the timelines for identifying the investor and then shortlisting the investor. Once you've identified the investor, then fairly maybe within 1 week the investor will give you a term sheet. And if it's a new company, then it doesn't take more than 2 to 3 weeks to do the LDD and maybe 2 weeks to close on the documents and then 1 week to close the deal. So for a startup, it generally takes 2 months. On a higher side, it can be closing 1 month also to basically raise any money from a HNI or a what do you call VC, PE guys as part of the seed investment or a Series A investment. But if it's a Series B, then if the business are complex and there are multiple investors who are already there in the company, then the negotiation, dev docs, your DD will take time. But for a startup which is looking for a Series A funding or a seed funding, 1 month could be aggressive, but 2 months is ideal, wherein the process can get closed. And for a what do you call growth company where there are already Series A, Series B investors, it can eventually run from 2 to 4 months. So it depends upon the complexity of the deal. So this is the process for raising fund for a what do you call company in India. As I said, once you have identified what is the requirement of fund, you will basically understand which investor should be ideal for your company, whether it should be a PE guy or a strategic guy, and how much equity you should raise. So that is also very, very important, because you should not raise what do you call more equity when the business doesn't require it, because equity is very, very expensive. It's not that you take the money and keep it in FD and then dilute the equity of the promoter. That becomes expensive. So and there is also what do you call element wherein you should not raise the equity too late. So once if you are thinking that, okay, let me raise money from the debt, I will only raise equity to the extent I need for 1 year, then it becomes very, very risky, because if you are not able to raise further funds, the business will fall flat. So that is very, very important. So gauging what is the exact requirement and then doing a funding and having a mix of promoter dilution and de-risking the company is very, very important. So how much equity, from whom, at what time, that is the important call and business requirement understanding the promoter should have before they start the process of fundraising. So we will discuss about the instruments which are available for a startup for doing any kind of a equity issuance. But before that, these are the regulators or legislations which will play a role for raising any money from an external investor for a company. So when I say legislation, the mother legislation would be Companies Act. Then if your investor is a foreign investor and if you're raising any money from a non-resident, then RBI regulations will also be tested. They also have to be seen whether the business which you are wanting to raise money is in compliance with the RBI regulations or not. and then the SEBI regulations are generally for companies which are listed, but for the purpose of discussion, we will not touch that regulations today because we are more concentrating on the fundraising cycle for a private limited company. So from a private limited company standpoint, Companies Act would be a mother legislation. If your investor is a foreign investor, then definitely we have to see the RBI regulations, and then the Stamp Act. Stamp Act maybe only for the purpose of emphasizing and thinking through what will be the stamp duty for the document, but that again is a legislation which can be taken care of. It doesn't have any nitty-gritty. It's only a duty which you have to pay to the stamp authority. But as a cash flow, that also has to be thought through how much money will go for a stamp duty. But from a compliance standpoint, Companies Act, RBI regulations, and the Income Tax Act. So when I say Income Tax Act has certain regulations which says at what money what valuation you should raise money, and if you breach those thresholds, then what happens? Whether if you have raised the money over a specific valuation, then whether that income will be taxed, or if you have raised below the valuation, then what happens? So that we will discuss in the next slide. But from a legislation standpoint, Companies Act, Stamp Act, RBI regulations, and Income Tax Act would be the crux, critical regulations which have to be thought through before you identify your investor. Because sometimes what happens is, if you have spoken to a non-resident investor and they are interested to invest in the company, but your business, maybe you are in the business of say multi-brand retail, single brand retail, maybe grocery, food, online sale, maybe marketplace. So in maybe this kind of regulations, there are a lot of RBI restrictions. So the non-resident investor who is proposing to invest in the company may not qualify as a investor in terms of the RBI regulations. So it becomes very, very important to understand the business and also identify what kind of investors you can get, whether you can get non-resident investors or not, or it is only resident investor who can give you money. So that is also very, very important before you target and choose your investor. Because once you have chosen the investor, and if at later point of time you get to know that this investor will not be able to invest in our company because of the business restrictions, then maybe the entire exercise will get futile. So it is very, very important to make sure that the set of investors whom we are chasing or talking should be compliant and should be able to invest in the company based on the law of land. Now, from an instrument standpoint, generally, I think all the promoter knows that there are two kinds of fundraising mechanism. One could be a capital raise, the other could be a debt raise. So when I say capital raise, it is a dilution of equity in the company, and when I say debt, it is like a loan which is payable after a certain period of time on maturity. But capital is non-payable, and it is a risk-based investment which the investor would put in the company for an equity upside. So there is a capital raise, there is a debt raise. So for the purpose of discussion, we are talking only today in terms of the capital raise. What kind of instruments are available in India under the Companies Act for raising any kind of a capital into the company. So when I say capital, again, there are multiple instruments. One is direct equity, the other one is a convertible instrument. So when I say direct equity, it's direct equity. You directly issue equity shares of the company pari passu with all the existing equity shareholders, and that's it. But when I say convertible instrument, so what happens is, when a promoter wants to raise funding from external investors, they could be in dilemma wherein they don't want to give direct equity. Basis the dilemma could be based on certain apprehensions. They don't know their valuation today, whether they are diluting their equity at a lower valuation, or they believe that the equity of the company will go further up, maybe next 1-2 years. Based on the numbers, the valuation of the company will be high. That's why they would want to in a direct equity you freeze the valuation, but in a convertible instrument you will not freeze the valuation. You will put it at a later point of time from a company standpoint. But if you want to freeze your valuation for a convertible instrument, you can do it. But generally promoters are using this instrument for the reason that they don't want to freeze the valuation. They may say, okay, I'm giving you convertible instrument today. It could be a convertible preference shares, or it could be a convertible debenture, wherein I will not determine my valuation today. I will give you a formula. So when I say formula could be maybe next round of fund. Whenever there is a next round of funding, whoever is the investor coming in the company, whatever valuation he is giving me, I will convert you to 25%, 30% discount to that. That could be one formula, or maybe you can link the formula to the revenue numbers of the company, EBITDA numbers of the company, or any financial number. It could be EBITDA, it could be revenue, it could be profit. So besides that, the conversion will happen. So you are basically deferring your pre-money valuation on day one. You are basically pegging it to the next round of valuation or event which is happening later. That's how the promoter thinks through when he is basically giving a convertible instrument. From an investor perspective, what happens is, if you see the direct equity versus the convertible preference shares, I'm not talking about convertible debenture. What happens is, preference shares are preferred stock over equity. So whenever there is a liquidation happening in the company, and if the corpus is less, once the debt holders are paid out of the company, the preference shareholder gets preference over the corpus before the equity. From that perspective, they will want to take preference shares, and on day one itself they'll say, okay, I will take preference share, this is my valuation, I will convert as and when I want, and then they continue to hold preference shares. From a promoter perspective, if promoter believes that the valuation of the company is not clear today, he may peg it to the future events, then the promoter use the convertible instruments. This is how the convertible instrument and direct equity is played out in different scenarios. So when I compare convertible preference shares with convertible debenture, preference shares are, again, they are part of the capital and they are senior to equity but junior to any debt. And when I say convertible debenture are as good as unsecured debt. So in case the company goes for liquidation, they get preference over any preferred stock of the company. So the waterfall would be your secured creditors, your unsecured where this debenture will fall, and then your preference shares, and then your equity. So from a waterfall perspective, debenture has priority over preference and equity, and for preference they have priority over equity. So for the promoter and for the investor becomes very, very important. Then again, once we have decided what kind of instruments we want to issue, whether we want to issue direct equity, whether we want to issue convertible, it could be a convertible preference share or it could be convertible debenture. Then you move ahead and then decide on the formulas, sign the debt docs, and then basically close the deal. So from an instrument perspective, there is one more instrument which is warrant. So warrants are generally not used traditionally by any startup until the investor believes that they don't know what kind of business they are investing and they just want to invest 10%, 20% of the subscription price and see how the business is doing and then decide whether they want to put in the balance money. Then the warrants are used. So warrants eventually means, okay, if you have somebody has to invest 10 crores, they have invested say 10 lakhs in the business and said, okay, in 18 months, either I will invest the balance, the warrant comes in. So you give a right to the investor to put in balance money. If they don't put in, the instrument gets forfeited, or if they put in, they get the equity shares of the company. That's how the warrant is played. But traditionally, warrants are not the instruments which are subscribed to when the investor wants to put in entire money. Warrants are only if they want to defer it for a later time and to see business how it is doing and then invest, and they are willing to basically forfeit their amount of investment, then warrant comes in. Otherwise, warrant is not the instrument which generally or traditionally any investor or a promoter would look for closing a deal in terms of capital infusion. So this is about the direct equity, convertible preference shares, convertible debentures, warrants. Again, so we spoke about the primary investment. There could be a secondary investment. So when I say primary investment traditionally means the investment into the company for de-risking the company. So the money comes into the company which is used for the business. When I say secondary investment traditionally means a transfer of the stock or equity of the company. So if there is a shareholder who wants to take exit, who wants to transfer shares, so they can identify another shareholder, and then another shareholder can basically buy the shareholding of this investor. That becomes a secondary transfer. So that is called as secondary investment, wherein the money is not coming into the company, but it is changing, the shareholding of the company is changing through a secondary purchase. So that is the secondary investment. Now, when I say valuation of instruments under different laws, now the basic premise here is, now once you have identified who will be your investor, what kind of instrument which you will be issuing to your investor, you also need to basically think through what are the valuation methodology in terms of different laws. So when I say different laws, it is basically the Companies Act, Foreign Exchange Management Act, and the Income Tax Act. These are the three legislation which primarily will impact any fundraising, and all the three legislations have different requirements. So all the three have to be basically seen so that there are no what you call non-compliance of any of the regulations. So that is also very, very important. So under the Companies Act today, if you see, there are two ways to issue capital. One is you can do a rights issue. Under the rights issue, the existing shareholders of the company will get a right to subscribe to the equity capital, and then on a pro rata basis, and the company will go ahead and issue the shares. So because it's a rights issue to the existing shareholder, the valuation requirement is not prescribed, because it is to the existing shareholder, and whatever is the price, whether it's 10 rupees, 50 rupees, 100 rupees, doesn't matter, because it is not to the external guy. So if it's a rights issue under Companies Act, you need not get any kind of a valuation done. But if you are doing a preferential allotment or a private placement, so when I say private placement or a preferential allotment, that means you are doing to a different set of investor, or you are doing to the current set, but you are only doing to couple of current shareholders. So you are basically recognizing maybe one investor, two investor, three investor from the existing bucket or from a new bucket, and trying to give them shares of the company. So that becomes a private placement or a preferential allotment. So when you are doing a preferential allotment, the intent of the legislation is that you should not basically give shares of the company at a lower valuation, because existing shareholders will get impacted. That's why Companies Act says that you have to get a valuation from a registered valuer. So registered valuer, again, there is a concept of registered valuer under Companies Act. Who can be a registered valuer? There is a process. So whoever is a registered valuer, from them you have to get the equity valuation of the company. So that is under the Companies Act, and the intent of the legislation is basically to make sure there is no value loss for the existing investor, because if you offload the equity of the company at a lower valuation, then the existing investors will get impacted. That's how the Companies Act has prescribed that. Make sure there is a valuation which is done by a registered valuer, and the company should not issue any shares below that valuation. So that is the intent of Companies Act. So when I come to Foreign Exchange Management Act, now again, Foreign Exchange Management Act will only play when there is a foreign investor. So if there is no foreign investor, if you are doing fundraising from a domestic investor, then this legislation will not apply. So assuming that you are doing investment raised from a foreign investor, then this legislation also has to be complied. So when I say you have to do a valuation under FEMA, that means that the equity valuation of the company has to be done by a chartered accountant or a SEBI registered merchant banker. So under Companies Act, you have a registered valuer. Those guys could be a chartered accountant, they could be a company secretary, cost accountant, but they have to issue shares as if they are registered valuer. They cannot say, okay, I am a chartered accountant and I am a qualified registered valuer. That's why I'm, as a chartered accountant, I am giving you a certificate. No, whoever is qualified to be a registered valuer, then they can issue a certificate with whatever formalities under the IBB law. They can issue the registered valuer certificate under the Companies Act. When it comes to FEMA, it has to be a chartered accountant or a SEBI registered merchant banker, and there is a methodology which has been prescribed. So when I say methodology, the law has said that the methodology through which you are computing your equity valuation of the company should be internationally accepted pricing methodology. So internationally accepted pricing methodology, again, it is the requirement and understanding of the valuer, that he should understand the business and determine what is the best way to value this company, whether it should be a discounted cash flow method, whether it should be a PE ratio method, whether it should be a asset valuation method, or any other method. So that is the discretion and knowledge of the valuer, at which he will basically determine how the valuation has to be done and whether the valuation is internally accepted or not. Generally in India, all the valuers tend to do a DCF, discounted cash flow method, which is basically discounting the future valuation of the company. They will take the future projection, then they will do the peer company multiple, and then they will try to arrive at a future valuation of the company. So DCF is the general method which is used by all the valuers, but it is again at the discretion of the valuer. If the company is asset light, if the company is asset intrinsic, there could be a different methodology. But now currently we see that the methodology which is used by all the valuers is DCF. And once you have a foreign investor, you go to a chartered accountant or a merchant banker, they will do the valuation and they will give you a certificate. The requirement of the law here is whatever fair market value which you have determined as per the Foreign Exchange Management Act, the issuance price should not be below that. So if a valuer has given you a price, say 100 rupees, so you can do a issuance at 105, 110, 120, 200, whatever, but it cannot be below 100. So that is the intent of law. There should not be any loss to the economy. The money is coming into India, so it should be always above the fair market value. That is the intent of the law. and it has to be taken care. So Companies Act, FEMA, you have to make sure that the fair market value by different valuer. If it's a rights issue, you don't need a certificate under Companies Act. But if you are doing preferential allotment, private placement, make sure that you have a certificate from a registered valuer. FEMA, whether it's a rights issue, whether it's if it's a rights issue, then again the valuation is not required there, but you have to make sure that the price at which you are offering shares to all the shareholders, including resident, non-resident, should be same. There cannot be different treatment for different set of investors. When I say different treatment, different investors, that means you should not have price of say 50 rupees for resident and 40 rupees for non-resident. It should be uniform for all the investors. You decide. You need not take a valuation certificate there, but make sure that the price at which the non-resident is offered the shares should not be less than at the price which the resident has been offered the shares. If you are doing a rights issue under FEMA, under Companies Act, no valuation requirement, but these are the under FEMA, make sure that this is taken care. And if it's a preferential allotment, private placement, definitely you have to get the valuation done under FEMA and make sure that the fair market value is always lower than the price at which the investor has subscribed to the shares. Now this is the Companies Act and FEMA. Now there is a Income Tax Act. Again, the Income Tax Act again basically tries to see whether the company is overvalued or undervalued. And if it's overvalued, then that difference becomes taxable in the hands of the company. And if it is undervalued, then the guy who is getting the benefit, if I am the investor, I am putting in the fair market value of the company is 50, I am putting at 40, then the delta 50 minus 40 gets taxed in my hands because that is the benefit which I got. But if the fair market value of the company is 50 and the investor has invested at say 60, then the company will get taxed because the company has got 10 rupees more than the fair market value. So this is the crux of Income Tax Act. Now the fashion it will work is whenever you are going for a fundraise and there is a premium involved, if an investor who is coming into the company is basically wanting to give premium for the business. So they may say, okay, your valuation is 5 crores, 10 crores, 20 crores, then that is a premium valuation they are giving. In that scenario, you have to make sure that you have a fair market value certificate from a merchant banker. So what happens is if the premium or if there is a premium 1 crore which has been given to the company, the value the company has to make sure that the premium is the price of shares which the company has got is not more than the fair market value. It should be matching. So if my partial value at which I am investing, I am taking investment from say HNI is 1000 rupees and my fair market value is say 950. That means 50 rupees is excess in my hand. So that gets taxed. That is one what do you call a basic fundamental which has to be understood, and the company has to take care of that. If the valuation is 1000, you should make sure that the investment at which the investment is happening is also 1000. That is very, very important. Second, now sometimes what happens is you don't even take a certificate from a merchant banker. You just say that okay, whenever there is a tax scrutiny, that time I will take care. Then what happens is when there is a tax scrutiny on the company, that time the assessing officer will ask you to produce a certificate from a merchant banker, which will show that your fair market value and the valuation of shares which you have got is equal. Then it's fine. But if you are not able to produce the certificate from a merchant banker, which is as on the date of the investment, then the entire money will be taxed based on the discretion of the assessing officer. So taking a certificate from merchant banker becomes very, very important if that section is applicable to the company, because there are certain exemptions. So when I say exemptions, now this Income Tax Act section 56, wherein this entire concept is captured, is not applicable to a registered startup who has registered themselves with DPIIT and they have got the tax exemption from the income tax department. So in the previous session we have discussed what kind of benefits the startups will have. This is one of the benefits. If you are a registered startup and if you have registered yourself with income tax department, then you have a tax holiday on the premium which you have taken from the company, subject to certain conditions. So if you are a registered startup, then this valuation is not required. And if you are not a registered startup, then make sure that you have a valuation, and that valuation is equal to your fair market value and the value which you have got into the business. So that becomes very, very important. And if that is not taken care, then the company will be prone to taxes which can be imposed by the assessing officer. So this is on the valuation. Now, once you have signed the term sheet and you have decided on the instrument and you have started the process, you have identified your investor, then maybe non-disclosure agreement maybe will be a first step in terms of sharing your data. So when I say sharing your data in the what you call entire process, which we discussed in the previous slide, you are sharing your collateral, you are sharing your teaser, you are sharing your numbers for taking interest from the potential investors. At that time, it is always better that you sign an NDA with the investors before before you share the data with them. So it is very, very important. You should not share any sensitive data with a potential investor without signing an NDA. So NDA would be, I say, step one. Then you share the data. Then they basically give you the term sheet. Then you move to the diligence and sign the dev docs. So NDA is very, very important in terms of sharing data, maintaining confidentiality. It generally covers what is the confidential or confidential information, what is the tenure of confidential information, how the investor who is basically evolving the deal can use this. And if you don't have that, then sometimes what happens is your confidential data gets leaked and it can be misused by other what do you call individuals. So it is always better that you sign the NDA before you share your collaterals. Teaser is fine. Teaser may not have a lot of sensitive data, but before you share your information memorandum, business plan, and other collaterals, you should sign the NDA. So as I said, maybe this is the coverage of the NDA, what kind of confidential information you are sharing, and what will be the duration of the confidentiality. It generally is 1 year because nobody would want to take any confidentiality obligation for perpetual period. So it has to have a term. It cannot be for perpetual. Generally, it is 1 year. But if you are able to negotiate for 2-3 years, fine. But 1 year is a market wherein any potential investors generally agree for 1 year. Now, term sheet. So when I say term sheet, again, once you have got a term sheet, the term sheet could be two ways. One term sheet could be non-exhaustive. The other term sheet could be exhaustive. So when I say non-exhaustive, it only talks about what is the pre-money valuation of the company, what kind of investment, what kind of instrument the investor wants to subscribe to, and then what is the exclusivity period, whether 60, 30, 90, whatever it is, who will bear the cost of due diligence and all, and then maybe how the deal gets closed, and other terms are basically pushed to the dev doc stage, wherein at the dev doc stage, the investor and the company will decide. That is one approach wherein you don't discuss about the rights which you are giving to the investors. You only talk about the valuation and how are you going to close it. But the other approach is exhaustive term sheet. When I say exhaustive term sheet, it will have all the what you call flavor of the final rights which the investor wants. So investor may say, okay, I want board seat, I want anti-dilution right, I want right of first refusal, I want liquidation preference, I want drag, I want tag, all that, right? So at the term sheet stage, maybe you will only discuss about certain critical rights. It could be board seat, it could be liquidation preference, information rights, exit. And the other rights, maybe you will just give a flavor and you will say, okay, this is what I intend to have, and I will discuss more about it in the dev doc stage. That's how the term sheets are framed, wherein you just talk about what kind of rights you intend to have, and then elaborate, deliberate at the dev doc stage. So this is the basic structure of the term sheet, wherein you will talk about the pre-money valuation, instrument, exclusivity, some rights, what is the intent of the investor, what kind of rights he wants, and then you close the term sheet. Generally, term sheets are non-binding. So when I say non-binding, the investors will do the due diligence, and if they want to proceed for the deal, they will proceed. If they don't want to proceed for the deal falls off there. No parties have any obligation. The investor walks off. The company is free to again go into the market and raise money from any other investor. So there are 2-3 what you call critical aspects which the promoter has to understand before they sign the term sheet. One, what is the exclusivity period? Exclusivity period should not be what you call more than 60 days. Again, it depends upon the kind of complexity you have in the business, but in terms of market, it's generally 60 days. So you give 60 days to the investor, they will do the diligence and they will close the deal. That is very, very important, because if you give too many days, then it becomes very, very painful for the company, because they cannot approach the other investors and this investor is taking too long to close the deal. So make sure that exclusivity period is properly negotiated. Then the kind of rights, you should always have a flavor, what kind of rights the investor wants, whether he wants a board seat, maybe exit rights, all that flavor has to be there. And then the pre-money valuation. What is the pre-money valuation? That also has to be clearly agreed, because if you leave the valuation to a later point of time, the entire exercise may become futile. So it is always better, and generally that is the way the term sheet is assigned, where you determine the valuation and then close the deal. And the expenses. So when I say expenses, once the term sheet is signed, there are certain expenditures which the investors will incur. They will appoint a lawyer, they will appoint a FDD guy, they will appoint maybe business diligence guys if required. So that comes with a cost. So who will bear that cost? So generally what we do is we say, if the deal gets closed, then the company bears with a cap. You will have a cap also, maybe 20, 30 lakh, whatever cap you want. If the deal doesn't get closed, then the investor has to bear, because if the investor has not closed the deal, the investor has to take that cost, because company cannot be burdened. So make sure that the cost and expenses clause is properly negotiated, and then maybe once you're clear, then you sign the term sheet. Then as we discussed, generally these are the three kind of diligence: financial, legal, business. Now just to give you a flavor, now purpose we have already discussed, why a financial DD is done, why a legal DD is done, why a business DD is done. But what happens? What is the outcome of a DD? There could be multiple outcomes. So what happens is when a DD is done, there are two sets of outcomes which can basically trigger. One would be whether the company has any non-compliances. One. Second, whether the whether the company has non-compliances. The other one is whether the valuation which the investor has given is having any kind of a risk from a regulatory standpoint. So that is also very, very important, which is the financial valuer, financial DD guy will determine. But primary purpose of doing a DD is to make sure that the investor knows everything. What is the stature of the company today? What is the status of its legal compliances? Are there any risks which the business is carrying, and how the investor will de-risk its investment? And then maybe in the dev doc stage, they will use this knowledge data which they have gained from the diligence guys and try to basically make sure that they properly negotiate the dev docs. If they want any condition precedents, when I say condition precedent, that would mean if there are any legal non-compliances or any other non-compliances of the company have to be rectified before the investors comes into the company, then they will say, okay, I will invest into your company, but make sure that this non-compliances are taken care. That could be one set of asks which the investor would have. The other set of asks could be maybe conditions subsequent. So when I say conditions subsequent, the issues which are critical, they will definitely want to be resolved as a condition precedent. The issues which can be done later or which are non-critical, they will give you a timeline, maybe 60 days, 90 days, 180 days based on the negotiation to get them done after the investment. But condition precedents are more painful. So it is always advised to the company that they should always be diligence ready. So when I say diligence ready, before you go into the market, make sure that you run a mock diligence in the company. So when I say mock diligence, it's a diligence done by a consultant which are appointed by the company. So they will get a mock diligence done. They will get to know the issues and they can rectify it before they start the process. If there are any bigger issues, then they know it will not be surprising to them when the investor runs the diligence process. So this is the one piece of advice which I will give to any business, any promoter who wants to go for funding, to make sure that they do a health check, mock diligence on the company, and try to identify any potential issues which can impact their valuation or which can derail the entire funding exercise. So that is also very, very important. But that again, so it is a wish list which any promoter should have. But whether they have that kind of luxury in terms of funds, in terms of time, that is a call which the promoter has to take. But it is always better, and it will add value, and it will also make sure that the timelines of the fundings are taken care. It will not derail the entire process of fundraising. So that is one bit of advice which I will give to any of the potential companies which are looking for investments. And then once the financial DD is done, legal DD is done, based on the knowledge data which the investor has got, he will try to negotiate his step talks. That is the entire purpose of financial legal DD from an investor perspective. Now, once FDD is done, LDD is done, and investor is fairly clear that he wants to invest in the business and is comfortable, then he will come out with shareholders and share subscription agreement. This is a nomenclature which generally is used, but it could be investment agreement, it could be any other name, but generally it's a document which will talk about what kind of instrument the investor will subscribe, what is the pre-money valuation, and what kind of exhaustive rights which the investor would want. It could be the management right, it could be exit rights, it could be minority protections, it could be AVRs, affirmative voting rights, it could be drag, it could be tag, non-compete, dispute resolution, exit mechanism, all that will be detailed in the document. So maybe next 5-10 minutes we'll spend on each right, which are critical for any of the investor, and it also becomes very critical for the promoters to understand why the investor is asking this right and how it will play for the promoter going forward. So one of the critical right which any investor will have, will want to have is a board seat. So when I say board seat, that means they would want to be on the board of directors of the company. So as promoter, you have to apply your mind, think through how many board seats you are giving to the investor for the percentage of equity you are diluting. So if you are diluting controlling equity, maybe you have to give controlling voting rights or controlling board seats. And if you are not giving them controlling, shareholding, then maybe you will not give them controlling board seats. So that is something which you have to figure out. If you are giving 25% to a shareholder, to an investor, maybe you will give 25% of the board seats. If you are giving 51%, then you will give maybe controlling board seats to the investors. So board seat is also very, very critical because the entire functioning will happen from the board. Then maybe your restriction on transferability. So when I say transferability, any investor who is coming into the business will definitely want the promoters to stay in the business. They will not want the promoter to leave when the investors come into the business, because investors come in only basis the credibility and comfort which they have on the promoters. So they will put restrictions on the promoter, which will say that okay, your shares will be locked in until the investors exit, or for a maybe specific period. Generally it is 5 years if it's a startup. If it's a company which is growing, which is already raised Series B, Series C, then the period could be shorter. But generally for a startup, it is 5 years, or it could be a scenario where the investor would say, I will only first exit, then only you should exit. As long as I'm in the company, you should not exit. So that is a transfer restriction on the promoter shares that any investors would want. Then maybe your right of first refusal, right of first offer, which an investor would definitely want, because if after a lock-in period, may say if the investors agree that they want to lock the shares of promoter or other shareholders in the company for 5 years, then after the lock-in period, the promoters are free to sell the shares. But the investors would definitely want that before they sell the shares to any third party, the investors should get an opportunity to buy them. So that is something which they would want. So they will want a right of first refusal or a right of first offer. There's a thin difference between refusal and offer, which I will not get into, but this is a right which they will definitely want. And then maybe they will also want an exit right. So when I say exit right, any investor who is coming into the company would want to exit from the company at a certain period. After a certain period, they don't want to be in the company forever, because they are in the business of investing. So they will say, okay, as promoter, you have promised that you will give me exit next 5 years, 6 years. But if you are not able to give me exit in 5 years, 6 years, then what? Then there is a mechanism of drag. They will say, okay, you have not been able to provide me exit for 5 years, then I will go into the market. I will try to sell my equity. But in case if the incoming investor wants the entire 100% of the company, then I will drag you on the same terms. So I will exit, but I will also take you out along with me. So they will want a dragging right on the promoters and other shareholders. This is also very, very critical for investors. And then maybe non-compete restrictions on the promoter. So when an investor comes into the company, he will not want the promoters to basically do similar business when they are the shareholders of the company and when they are running shows. That is obvious. So they will have non-compete during the tenure of their employment, shareholding in the company. And after that, so maybe after the lock-in is done, or after maybe the investor has invested, the promoter leaves the company for any reason, they have lived and they have left the employment of the company, they can continue as a shareholder, but they have left the employment of the company. Then what happens? Whether they can go out and then compete, they can't. There will be a restriction where it will be for 2 years, 3 years, whatever. So if the company, they have to take an obligation to basically make sure that they are not competing with the business of company where the investor has invested. So this is one wish list or one ask which will definitely come from any investor. And then there could be other rights which the investor would want. The information rights, representation on warranties, how the funds will be utilized, what happens if there is a deadlock, how you will resolve the deadlock, whether it will go into arbitration, whether we have to go for direct dispute mechanism, you will approach a court, all that will be there, the boilerplate clause will be there. So one critical aspect which promoters should take care is the representation and warranties which they are giving to the investor. So when I say representation and warranties, that means you are saying, you are basically telling the investor on paper that my company is clean, it doesn't have any liability, and after you invest in the company, your value is secure till the date, and you have invested to the extent on the date you have invested in the company. So for future events, as a promoter, you will not be able to give representation warranties. But for historical issues, historical business, you will give a reps and warranties. But when you are giving reps and warranties, make sure that there are certain carve-outs. So when I say carve-outs, there has to be a cap. What could be a maximum liability which can come onto the company or the promoter if the representations are basically false or are basically calling for any kind of an indemnity claim on the promoters. So make sure that there is a cap. So generally the cap is the investment amount which the investor has invested. There should not be any consequential or indirect losses which the promoter or the company has to basically safeguard the investor for the losses. So it's very important that the representation and warranty along with the indemnity clauses, whatever the representation and warranty which you are giving, and the representation and warranty which are backed up with indemnities, make sure that there is a de minimis, there is a cap, then there is a tenure. So the indemnity cannot be for perpetuality. It has to have a specific period, whether it's for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, that has to be negotiated, and basically make sure that there is a period which falls off after a specific agreed timeline. So make sure that representation warranties are properly negotiated, and there's one more point which I want to add. As promoters, you are running the business. There could be a lot of issues. There could be regulatory claims which can come onto the company which the promoter doesn't know, because today the regulatory atmosphere in India is basically works in a way wherein we think that we are 100% compliant, but there could be a regulator who will interpret in a different way, and he will issue a show cause notice on the company and say, okay, you have breached this law, or you have breached this, and I have a claim of 1 crore on you. So as promoter, I don't know. So I don't want to get into that kind of a mess. So if the company is taking care, fine. But as promoter, I don't want to involve my personal assets into my business. So there should always be a carve out wherein the personal assets of the promoter should not be touched by the investors in any scenario. If there is a fraud, if there is a willful misconduct, if there is a negligence, then the discussion is different. But as long as everything is done in good faith, the promoter should not basically get any kind of issues on the personal assets. That carve out has to definitely be there in the indemnity clause, which has to be properly negotiated by the promoter, because when the investors are coming in, they tend to want, they will basically want to have everything. So properly negotiate, have a good lawyer, then only basically this kind of issues can be taken care, because we don't know when the company will go bad. Things are bad today. Investor is gung-ho, you are gung-ho, everything is gung-ho, business is gung-ho, everything is fine. But when the things go south, that time all this will be read, interpreted, and then different recourse can be taken. So make sure that everything is crystal clear, watertight, and then properly negotiated when we are negotiating the shareholders agreement. So these are the key terms of a shareholders agreement, a subscription agreement, and then how do you close the deal? So once you have signed the term sheet, you have run the process of due diligence, you have passed the process of due diligence, then you have negotiated the dev docs. As per the dev docs, there will be a timeline, maybe 30 days, 60 days, 15 days, whatever, how the closing will happen. So you will have a company secretary who will do all corporate secretarial work. He will pass all the resolutions. He will do all ROC compliances, RBI compliances. That's how the deal gets closed. So this is the entire ecosystem of the deal. So there are 3-4 things which I would like to tell to all the promoters or any ecosystem player who is wanting to work on the funding side. Whenever a company believes that they want to raise money, there are 3-4 things they should basically take care. One, the hygiene issues in the company. So when I say hygiene issues, the cap table has to be clean, because when the investors start the diligence, that time if they find that the cap table is loose, then it becomes very, very difficult for the investors to buy that there are no issues in the company. So cap, and maybe you will be able to fix if there are issues, but why do you want to put in energy when everything can be taken care from day one? So make sure that the cap table is very, very clean. Second, the compliance level of the company in terms of licenses, in terms of consents, in terms of secretarial records, RBI, ROC filings, all that is up to mark, because if there are issues, then the investor will try to derail the funding process and then try to negotiate on the valuation. So it becomes very, very hard for the promoter, and the promoter end up giving at a lower valuation. So make sure that these hygiene issues, compliance issues are taken care, and then negotiate the dev docs properly, because in the dev docs, the company might be desperate to get the money, and they end up negotiating the dev docs by giving too many rights to the investor. So what happens is if the things are fine, everything is fine. But if the things go bad, then it becomes very, very difficult and the promoter can lose the company. Because in the dev doc, there are a lot of scenarios where there are event of defaults. If the event of default occurs, then what happens, whether the promoter share can be bought at a very, very low price and the promoter may lose the control from the company. So make sure that whenever you are negotiating the docs, you know what kind of rights you are giving to the investor and what kind of mechanism you have and what kind of mechanism the investor has in case if the finally the documents are tested in the court and if we move to a litigation. So hiring a good lawyer is very, very important. Understanding the terms of the documents are very, very important. And it's only a process. So once you have completed the process, once the investor is onboarded, then everything is fine because you are all married now. But when things go back, that time it all opens up. So one of the other key document would be the employment contract, which any investor would want the key employees of the company to sign. So when I say key employees, promoters are definitely the key employees and they will also sign the document along with the other key employees. So when I say other key employees, there could be management employees like CTOs, CFOs, or other key employees who are very critical for the business. So they will ask all the key employees to sign the employment contracts, which will basically talk about the roles and responsibilities, the compensation, the non-compete obligation, non-solicitation obligation, non-disparagement obligation, what is the term of the contract, how the termination can happen, whether there is a severance pay, whether there is a garden leave, all that will be there in the employment contract when it comes to the key employees. So negotiating the employment contract for key employees is also very, very important because end of the day, if you are giving controlling stake to the investor who is coming into the company, they will also have board seats which are controlling for them. And as promoters, you might be the shareholder of the company, but if the board believes that you are not, you should be removed or you are not needed for the business, or they have other professional guys who can run the business, they may ask you to leave. So when they are asking you to leave, then what kind of protections you want? Whether there should be a severance pay, or there should be a garden leave, whatever. So that all is captured in the employment contract. And when it comes to the promoters should make sure that non-compete is properly negotiated, because once you are out of the company, you should not take non-compete for a larger period. It should be maybe 1 year, 2 years. So that also has to be properly negotiated. So key employees, again, as part of promoters key employee contracts, you should make sure that the entire terms are clear, and term and termination along with the consequences of terminations are properly negotiated, so that tomorrow if you are out of the company, you continue to be a shareholder of the company, but you still don't have any restriction and you can earn your bread and butter. So it is very, very important that the contracts which you are signing with the investors are well understood, well taken, and implemented in spirit. So today, maybe as I previously said, you might require money, you want to basically sign whatever the investor puts before, but it's always better that you understand and then sign. So that would be my one advice to any promoter who is signing any kind of a contract, because the draft which are coming from the investor would be one-sided, the first draft. But if you negotiate and if you have logics, the investors will definitely understand. But if you bluntly just sign it, then it becomes very, very difficult for the promoters in case if the things are going bad. So that's it from my side. So we will take up the questions maybe at last. So I will request my colleague Anita to take her presentation and run us through the topics which she will be taking.
Sure. Thank you, Prashant. Can you please, yeah. Yeah, so I will now quickly move to the next topic, which is importance of legal contracts. So what is a legal contract? So a legal contract is basically an agreement or arrangement between two or more parties for a certain specific purpose. So the Indian Contract Act 1872 is the primary legislation in India which governs the contracts. So a contract can be oral or it may be in writing. Oral contracts, interestingly, have been upheld by Indian courts time and again, and they have upheld that oral contracts have the same binding value and enforceability as a written contract. However, it is very tricky and difficult to prove the existence of an oral contract. And the burden of proof lies on the person who claims the existence of the oral contract. So therefore, it is always advisable to have a written contract in place which lays down the mutual understanding of the parties in writing, which is signed between the parties, and it's always advisable to have a legal contract. So a legal contract is a valid written legal contract is required so that it provides a record of what was agreed, and it creates rights of each parties that are enforceable under law. So there are some ingredients to have a legal contract. The basic ingredients are that it should be between the parties who are capable of contracting, which means that a person should not be of unsound mind, he should be a major. Then there should be lawful consideration, which is mentioned in the contract. Then the parties who are entering into the contract must give their free consent. They should not be misrepresented, any undue influence, any coercion on any of the parties to enter into a contract. And they should enter into a contract for a legal object. They cannot enter into a contract for carrying out any illegal activities. So these are some of the basic ingredients of a legal contract. Then there, for a company to run and to operate its business, there are various kinds of agreements which it needs to enter into in the ordinary course of business. So various commercial contracts, it can be service agreement, supply agreement, advertisement agreements, marketing agreements, agreements with consultants. So depending on business to business, obviously the contracts may vary, but there are a lot of commercial agreements which the company needs to enter into with various parties. So some of the important clauses of these agreements are, firstly, the commercial terms, the rights and obligation of the parties, what is the roles and responsibility of each party. So those needs to be carefully thought through and recorded by way of the legal written contract. And then the next important term is on the payment terms. So statutory, there is no time limit within which payment has to be made. So that should be thought through, negotiated, and put down in writing in a contract. For example, what is the milestone when an invoice has to be raised? When the payment has to be made after raising of invoice? What happens if the payment has not been made within the prescribed time period? So all these things should be ideally negotiated and captured in the contract so that the timelines with regard to payment are crystal clear. Then next important clause in an contract is indemnification. So indemnification is basically a mechanism by which the indemnifier absolves the indemnified party from any losses in case of breach of contract. So again, statutorily, there is no mention of what is the quantum of loss that one can claim from the other in case of breach of contract. And in the absence of such statutory control, the indemnity clauses are one of the most extensively negotiated clauses in a contract. So they are negotiated on basically 2-3 parameters. One is the scope of indemnity. So what are the items on which the indemnifier has agreed to provide indemnity to the indemnified party. Then what is the limit on liability? So you cannot have, so it's always advisable that you have put a cap on the liability, so that it's not that, since there is statutorily no control has been prescribed, so it's always advisable to have a cap on the liability mentioned in the agreement itself. Then the third is time limit, so that until when such indemnity clause shall survive. So it is very important that all those clauses are appropriately negotiated and put forth in the contract. Then next is confidentiality, non-disclosure. So as Prashant had earlier also mentioned the importance of having such clauses in the agreement, because when you enter into an agreement with the other party, you obviously share your business information, you share your financial information. Depending on contract to contract, there is a lot of confidential information that is shared by one party to another party. Therefore, it is important that the confidentiality obligation is there on the other party, such that there is no there is no disclosure of confidential information, which is vital to the business of the company. And of course, there are certain exclusions and limitations which are there, pursuant to which, to certain extent, for example, maybe as required by any statutory authorities or courts of laws, such confidential information may be shared. And then the time limit until which such confidentiality shall survive should also be mentioned in the agreement. Then intellectual property rights. So this particularly becomes important for certain specific contracts, like you're entering into a software development agreement with any developer. So it is important that when the company is getting the IP developed, software developed, the intellectual property rights which belong to that software, to that particular product, should be assigned to the company. So this clause is particularly important in certain specific kind of contracts, and should be appropriately drafted and written and agreed in the agreement. Then other important clauses are exclusivity, non-compete, non-solicitation. Exclusivity is when you, suppose you've entered into a supply agreement. So you want that particular supplier to exclusively supply to you certain products. So in that cases, obviously depending on commercial consideration of the parties, you may have such kind of clauses in the agreement. Non-compete, non-solicitation. So as we had mentioned earlier, non-compete is that you're restricting somebody to enter into the same segment of business in which you are there. Since you enter into a contract with people, then you tend to share your confidential information, business information. So they should not be using that and try and create a competing entity. So it's important that we have non-compete restrictions in the agreement, which is during the existence of the contract and termination of the contract. Non-solicitation, again, this restricts the other party from soliciting your employees, your clients, your vendors for a certain period of time. So all these should be properly thought through and appropriately mentioned in the agreement in terms of scope, territory, area, all of this. And next is termination and dispute resolution. So how termination will occur for a particular agreement? If the term is mentioned, everything went well, then it will obviously automatically terminate at the end of a particular term. But if an agreement has to be terminated prior to expiry of the term, then what are the instances in which one party has a right to terminate the agreement during the continuance of the term? So all these terms, and what happens when the contract is terminated, what are the consequences of termination, what are the post-termination obligation on each party. So all these things should be properly negotiated and put through in the contract. Then the last one would be dispute resolution, wherein if there's a dispute at all, then what is the mechanism for resolving the dispute, whether arbitration or any jurisdiction of courts which has been mentioned in the agreement. So this is on the commercial contracts which companies enter into with various vendors and suppliers and for service agreements. Now the next category is employment contract. So this you enter into with all your employees. Usually what we have seen is that startups are usually little, they don't usually have a proper signed contracts with the employees, which may in future lead to problems. And it's very important that you have a proper signed contract. And as Prashant was mentioning earlier, the due diligence portion, and also at that point of time also, investors do ask for employment contracts, especially for certain key employees who are very critical and important for the business. So it's very important that we have an executed contract with the employees. And the key terms which is usually covered in an employment contract is the rights and responsibilities, roles and obligations, the compensation which is payable to an employee, the bonus, if and how, whether it's at discretion of the company, whether it's mandatory that every year so much has to be paid. So all those terms will have to be captured appropriately. Again, confidentiality and non-disclosure is very important for an employee contract, because an employee working with the company obviously has information and is privy to all the confidential and vital business information. So he should have confidentiality obligations whereby he does not disclose confidential information of the company in an unethical manner. Then non-compete, as we previously also dealt with, non-compete is again a very important clause, wherein since an employee is privy to the business information, how the business works, and all of that. So it's very important that we have non-compete obligation on the employee post termination of the agreement. Exclusivity, which will again mean that he should work exclusively for the company. He should not be working with others simultaneously, and he should be in full-time employment of the company. Intellectual property rights, again, this is an important clause because whatever is developed by the employee during his tenure of employment with the company, all that should stand assigned to the company. So this particular clause should be included in the agreement to ensure that the IP of any product which is developed independently by the employee or in assistance with other employees is all assigned to the company. Then termination and dispute resolution mechanism. So termination, basically that company will have a right to terminate the employee upon certain events. So those events should be appropriately captured in the termination contract, and what would be the post termination obligation of an employee. Dispute resolution mechanism, as I mentioned earlier, would mention the jurisdiction and the arbitration mechanism in a contract. Then next topic for the session is employee stock option scheme. So an employee stock option scheme is basically a plan which is developed by a company for grant of options to its employees. And it's particularly important for startups because startups are not very cash rich. And in order to attract talent, and if they can't pay higher salaries, and if they want to attract talent, then grant of stock option is the best way to attract talent in the company. So the options, grant of employee stock option is governed under the Companies Act 2013. So you need to pass, a company needs to pass a special resolution. However, for private companies, ordinary resolution will be sufficient. And the documentation which you need to make will be an employee stock option plan, which would lay down the entire gamut of how the scheme would operate and what will be the manner of acceptance of options granted, vesting procedure which the employee must follow in order to exercise the options. So this employee stock option scheme will be the master document which would lay down how the employee stock options would work, and a grant letter is issued, which is issued individually to all the employees, which would lay down the number of options which are granted to each employee and what will be the milestones which they need to achieve, when will the options vest in them. So when we talk of stock options, there are three important terms for employee stock options. One is grant of options, second is vesting of options, third is exercise of options. So grant of options is when you grant so many number of options which you've written in the grant letter to the employees. Then in the grant letter, you also mention the milestones. So milestones may be either performance based, it can be time based also. So when you mention the milestones and when these milestones are achieved, which means that the options which have been granted have become vested in the employee. Vested means the employee has the right, now the employee has the right to convert those vested options into equity shares. And next term is exercise. Exercise is when employee actually exercises his right to convert the vested options into equity shares of the company. So these are the three important terminologies for ESOP. One is grant, option, vesting, and exercise. And as per Companies Act, there has to be a time period of 1 year between grant of options and vesting of options. So it cannot happen that the options have been granted on day 1 and on day 2 or 3 or 10 it can get vested. So there has to be a minimum time period of 1 year between grant of options and vesting of options. Now there is a prescribed definition of employee under the Companies Act. So who is an employee under the Companies Act? A permanent employee of the company who is working whether in India or outside India. A director of the company, which includes a whole-time director but excluding an independent director. The employees of the holding or the subsidiary company who are working in or outside India. And there are certain exclusions also under the Companies Act, which includes the employees who belong to the promoter and promoter group, and any director who is directly or indirectly holding more than 10% in the company. However, for the startups, there is a relaxation, and these two exclusions are not applicable for a period of 10 years from the date of incorporation or registration with DPIIT. So that relaxation has been granted for the startups. The exclusions are not applicable to them. Then on the exercise price. So when we grant the options and we issue grant letter, as per Companies Act, companies are free to decide the exercise price of the options. So when you grant options, usually the exercise price will vary for employee to employee depending on the tenure that he has served in the company. For example, if the employee has been there in the company right from the beginning and has given his sweat and effort to grow the business and has and the valuation of the company has grown, then the price at which he may be issued options can be the face value, which is the initial price when he had entered into the company. And as the company grows and new employees come in between, so exercise price, whatever is the valuation of the company at that point of time, based on that, the exercise price for those employees who have come in between may be determined. So company is free to determine the exercise price for the employees. And as I mentioned, that it would depend on the time when a particular employee has joined the company, and at that point of time, what has been the growth and valuation of the company. So there are certain tax implications at the time of exercise of option by the employees. So when an employee exercises his vested options, then when an employee exercises his options, then the difference between the fair market value and the exercise price is taxed as a perquisite, and the employer deducts TDS or employee deducts TDS on the perquisite which is to be paid by him. And when this employee sells the shares, then the difference between the fair market value and the sale price is taxed as capital gain. So capital gain may be short term or long term depending on the tenure for which he has held the shares. So that is the tax incidence on the employees. And then coming to whether how can the options be issued by an Indian company to its employees who are working outside India. So an Indian company can issue options to its employees who are residing outside India. However, the same has to be in accordance with the sectoral caps which is applicable to that particular company, and a form ESOP is required to be filed within a period of 30 days from the grant of options. And a foreign company can also issue options to the employees of its Indian subsidiary. In that case, the Indian company has to make an annual filing on the number of options that has been granted and the price which the employee has remitted. So these are the compliances. These are the compliances whenever the stock options are issued by a foreign company to the employees of the Indian subsidiary. So so that's it from my side on the employee stock option scheme. And now we can take the question. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I'll add, maybe I'll 10 minutes add some flavor to the employee stock option. Maybe some participant would also want to understand, are there any alternatives to employee stock options? So Anita has rightly said what is the ingredients for employee stock option, but there could be a scenario where the companies would not want the employees of the company to come on the cap table, right? So in that scenario, we have phantom stock mechanism, we have stock track unit mechanism, wherein you give the employee the upside of the equity, but you will never have them on the stock table. So that is one avenue which is available for the promoters in case if they want to make sure that the cap table is not heavy and the employee should not come on the come and sit on the cap table. So this is a mechanism of phantom stock or stock track unit, wherein you will give the upside to the promoters, to the employees, but they will not sit on the cap table. And then maybe as rightly said by Anita, you will implement a scheme, then the employee will exercise the shares. What happens when the employee exercises the shares, whether there are any tax implications, how the accounting will play. Generally what happens is when you are issuing any stocks to the employee on the day of issuance, which is the grant date, the valuation has to be done by the company for the for determining the fair market value of the option. So when I say fair market value of the options, that would mean that if you have given the employee the share at 10 rupees and the fair value of the company is say 100, so the difference between 100 and 10, which is 990, will get debited to the P&L account of the company. So that becomes a employee cost. So that is a hit which the company has to take on the day of grant. That is one, what you call, understanding the company has to have, because sometimes what happens is if you are deferring your options, larger options, maybe for a longer period, there could be a year where you have a heavy hit to the P&L. So make sure that you are giving stock option to the employees properly as and when required. It's not that you just pull everything and give a hit to the P&L at a specific point of time. So that becomes very, very bad on the balance sheet. Then once the grant has been done, once the P&L has been hit, then the exercise comes. So when there is an exercise by the employee, that time the employee has to pay tax. So when the employee is paying tax, then again the company has to do a fair valuation. And if the exercise price is 10 and if the fair value is say 100, that 990 becomes the income on the hands of the employee, and the employee has to pay tax. So from accounting standpoint, there is one valuation requirement. From a tax standpoint, again at the time of exercise, there is one valuation requirement. So you implement the scheme, you get the grant done, take a hit in the P&L, and then once the employee exercise, you do valuation, the employee pay tax. This is the entire ecosystem of employee stock option plan. But as I previously said, if the promoters, the company doesn't want the employee to come on the stock table, then maybe we have different mechanism of phantom stock and stock track unit, wherein we can make sure that the equity upside is given to the employee in a different way. So that is also available. Maybe if anybody has any questions there, maybe we can discuss often. But there are mechanisms where this can be taken care. Yeah. Yeah, Anita.
So we don't have any questions as of now, and there's only one question which has been asked, that is Samishti legal or registered valuer. So
no, we are not registered valuers. We are lawyers who are predominantly working on the corporate side, helping companies for their corporate law requirements, fundraising, private equity. We see when the company is getting into fundraising, we are advising the promoter company from the fundraising side. We are also assisting the investors for doing diligence, for drafting the dev docs, closing the deals, and we are extensively working on the Foreign Exchange Management Act, inbound outbound investments, drafting legal contracts, working with startups, incubation centers, other accelerators, wherein we are providing our services to the accelerators along with the startups which have been incubated by those startups. So we are predominantly working on the corporate side. We are not valuers. Yeah.
Yeah. So next was, what are the services which Samishti provides? So I think Prashant just mentioned that what all are the services which we provide. And then there's one question: is there any minimum qualification for a company to issue ESOPs?
You want to take, Anita, or shall I take?
I didn't understand the question clearly. Is there any minimum qualification for a company to issue ESOPs?
Yeah, so the qualification is from the standpoint to whom the ESOP can be issued. The company doesn't have any qualification. So for companies who are not startups, the promoters of the company cannot be given ESOP. If the company is a startup, then the promoters can also be given ESOP. So from a qualification perspective, no qualification, but only it is predominantly for the employees of the company. That's it. There is a process. How do you do it? Otherwise, there are no restrictions. And as rightly said by Anita, once you have given any stock option, it has to have a minimum 1 year for getting it to a vesting stage. It cannot be maybe you have given a grant today and then that gets vested tomorrow. So there has to be a minimum 1 year period. Otherwise, it's only a process and a mechanism and an implementation which the company has to do.
So there are some people who are asking for fees. I would request them to share one-on-one emails to us with your particular case specific, what is your problem statement, and then we can come back on the fees with our scope of work and fees. So, yeah.
Anita, there are a few more questions, right?
Yes. There's one question which has come. What are the ways an investor can invest in the company and the maximum limit?
See, again, as I discussed in my presentation, one. The ways are generally twofold. One is the capital instrument. The other one is the debt investment. So capital instrument, we have already discussed what kind of instrument they can invest. And debt, again, it's a pure loan. There are restrictions. There are certain laws which have to be complied when it comes to what kind of investor is investing, whether it's a foreign investor or a resident investor. So these are the what you call predominant ways at which the investor can invest in the company. Now, the limit, again, there is no specific limit at which the cap has been put for a company, but there could be a limit when it comes to foreign investors who are investing in a specific business. When I say foreign investor, if there is a say multi-brand retail business, only 51% FDI is allowed. If it's a say agriculture business, then 0% FDI is allowed. So again, if it's a foreign investment, then there are restrictions. Otherwise, for a domestic investor, there are no limits. It all depends upon the commercial negotiation which the promoter and the investor have.
Yeah.
Any other question, Anita?
No, there are requests for PPT sharing, so no questions as such.
There is one question on startup registration. Yes, we do take up startup registrations. So if a startup is interested to basically get themselves registered with DPIIT and the income tax department, we provide those services. There is one more question. Is FEMA required for NRI investment? Can a NRI invest in agro business? See, NRI investment, again, as I said, there are two types of investments which NRI can do. One is repatriation investment. The other one is non-repatriation investment. So when I say non-repatriation investment, traditionally, if a NRI has NRO account in India, then maybe he can invest from that account on non-repatriation basis. And if an NRI who wants to invest from foreign jurisdiction, they can also invest in repatriation basis, wherein FEMA, what do you call, FDI regulations will apply. But if he's an NRI who has a NRO account in India, wants to invest, he will be eligible to invest. It will be a non-repatriation basis. When I say non-repatriation, he will not be able to take out the capital appreciation out of India. The capital appreciation has to again be credited to his NRO account, and he can invest. So agro business, again, FDI in agro business is restricted. Agriculture cannot get any kind of an FDI. So for non-repatriation basis, yes, he can invest.
We've got one more question. You talked about mock due diligence. How can one go about that?
So when I say mock diligence, it is a diligence which the company gets it done from a consultant which the company will appoint. So I don't know if mock diligence is the right word, but it is a full-fledged diligence which you will get it done. It's like a health check, which you will basically get it done from an external counsel to understand that what if an investor does the diligence, what kind of issues can crop up, and then you try to basically make sure that those things are taken care so that there are no issues later and the process of fundraising is smooth and there is no derailment of the funding. So mock diligence, again, it's a diligence which you get it from your side by appointing competent lawyers, competent auditors to make sure that there are no leakages in the compliance system of the company, and make sure that there are no, what do you call, timelines which get lapsed because of this. That's how you get it done. So we do that. We, based on our experience, we work with a lot of companies because we work with investors, we work with the startups, so we know what kind of issues the investors will be more keen to know. So we help the promoters to make sure that there are those issues are taken care so that the process of fundraising is smooth and then it's fast.
Yeah, that's it on the questions for now. There are no additional questions.
So, Anita, you want to go ahead with the closing remarks?
Yes. So thank you everyone for attending the session. I hope that both the session series 1 and series 2 have been really helpful for you all to really understand very important aspects which are very critical for a startup, and to know them in advance. And if you want to get in touch with us for any of the services, we provide all of these services to we've provided these services to a lot of startups, and we look forward to providing the services. And if you have any questions that you want to raise to us, please do write to us email ID. You can visit our website also and check all the services that we have been providing. And that's it from my side, Prashant. Maybe you can add further.
Yeah, so for this series, these were the topics, but we'll continue to come up with new topics wherein the other set of crowds will be interested, like Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, FAMAD, Foreign Exchange Management Act, M&A, your what do you call IPO, SEBI, Companies Act. So we will be conducting full-fledged sessions on those topics also. So keep tracking our LinkedIn page, Facebook page to know more about our series, and then that's how you will get to know about our season. Then maybe we can stay in touch. So that's it. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending.